Hello guys, in this video I'll be making this small diorama set in England in World War II. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you might remember that back in 2021 I built this lovely Tamiya Tilly kit. I was really happy with the way that turned out, but it's been sitting on my shelf with its door open for a couple of years now. Recently, looking at a couple of reference photos gave me some inspiration for a small diorama with a vehicle's path being blocked by some sort of animal, cows or sheep or something. I did look for some good 3D printed models of cows and sheep, but I couldn't find any, so I snapped up one of these Miniart sheep sets, found that it contained 15 sheep of several different types, and I got to work putting them together. To be honest, this is not one of Miniart's best kits. The mating surfaces are a bit rough and they don't contain any guidance pins. But of course, the organic shapes of sheep mean that we can do a bit of sanding and a bit of filling to get around that. Here are some of my sheep after building but before cleanup. And roughly this is how I want them on the diorama, with the tilly stopped, the sheep sort of pouring out in front of it, blocking its progress. Very many tillies were driven by women from the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, during World War II, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to use a figure from that branch of the army. I was really lucky because recently Artejoal, one of the patrons that I support, released this set of 3D printed figures. Now the scene is actually some airmen playing football with some supporters standing around, but this particular supporter looks quite sort of exasperated and anxious, and I thought that pose would go really well with my diorama. So I 3D printed her. This is what she looks like after a bit of cleanup and priming. You can see there's some lovely details there. And she will be placed just outside the door, sort of gesticulating at these sheep to get out of the way. And of course I'm going to have a road coming roughly down the side, so the tilly's very much boxed in, and a gate where the sheep have somehow found their escape. I decided not to go with a square or rectangular base to the diorama, but instead a more sort of random curved shape. In order to build the walls at the side, I took some leftover foam, used some cocktail sticks to hold it into position, and create a narrowed channel between them. Then I started to fill those channels with some stones. These are from a railway modelling supply store. I applied a mix of PVA glue and water, initially with a brush, and then I realised a pipette would work a lot better. And I was hoping here that the foam would give some shape to the walls without hopefully sticking to the stones. I did this over a couple of sessions, adding some stones, giving it a good shake to get them to settle down properly, gluing them in, waiting for that to dry, and then adding another layer on top. And I think that generally speaking that was successful. I was able to remove the foam barriers and leave a good looking dry stone wall. Yes, as I did so there was a bit of flexing going on there and maybe a slight bit of collapse, but I think that just gives a bit of a more natural look to the wall anyway. We can see, particularly on the far wall there, there's a couple of gaps, but there's no reason we can't just put some extra stones in there to fill those up. So overall I was pretty happy with the way that turned out. I also knocked together a small gate to go in the gap. Here I've got some balsa wood for the gate posts and some coffee stirrers to make the gate itself. I didn't film this because it's quite small, it would be all my fingers and thumbs in the way. But I'm fairly happy with that result, maybe slightly out of scale, but not too bad. Now one of the weird things I do is keep the leftover bits of photo etch from the kits that I build, and I'm thinking that this part here would make a very nice hinge for that gate. I've also got these two buckles which I think are for my SDKFZ7/1, which I think would make a great bracket for a bolt on that gate. So I cut them out, bent them into shape, attached them with super glue, and I think that adds a nice amount of detail there to that gate. The bolt itself was made from a small amount of electrical wire, with of course the plastic coating stripped away. I'm quite pleased with that. Before I added any terrain, I wanted to add an edging for the base. For that I used some 0.4mm veneer with some PVA glue and large amounts of tape to hold it into place while that glue dried. I probably should have used Night Shift's trick here of using some double-sided tape. Then I cracked open a pot of my favourite acrylic paste, which is the dry ground paste from AK. I started to apply that to the base, and then I realised that it wasn't going to look very good at the moment because of course that XPS foam is dead flat, and even with the texture paste on top of it, it's still really clear that the underlying base is flat. So before I went any further, I took these offcuts of XPS foam. I tend to keep these around when I'm trimming things down to size, and even though they're very thin, they do make a perfect kind of material for just changing the height of the terrain slightly. So I've got this thin one here that I've torn up into strips. This would be the sort of the centre area of the road with the wheel ruts on either side of it, plus a few more around the edge of the sheep enclosure, as I wanted that to gently slope down towards that gate, because of course that's what tends to happen when you have a gate. You can tend to get quite a lot of erosion and wear underneath and around the gate, and I'm trying to simulate that here. Even though they are tiny, it will make quite a difference to the final terrain effect. Then I cut my veneer down in several places to make it more level with the XPS foam. Ultimately the texture paste will go over the top of that veneer's edge to have a kind of continuous, infinite plane of terrain. Then I finally got back to putting the paste on. I seem to have lost my spatula, so I'm using this old paintbrush, which is not really the best tool for the job. But you can make a small amount of paste go quite a long way. In the initial pass I'm just trying to cover all of the foam. I'm not worried about any sort of texture in there or patterns or anything like that, brush marks, etc. Once I'd covered the terrain, I went for putting the basic textures in. So for the road we want some tyre marks. That's done using the end of a brush. For the field area, even if the ground is dry now, it's reasonable to think that it's England, so it's been wet at some point in the past. And with lots of sheep there, I wanted to make a sort of churned up, muddy, even if it's dried mud, appearance there. At this point I sprinkled some sand onto the road, which for some reason I didn't film, plus some stones of various sizes, but only in very small amounts, down the centre of the road at the edges and generally near the wall as well. To stop them looking like they were floating on top, those stones were then pushed in gently with a paintbrush. Even if the field is now dry, at some point in the past it would have been wet and churned up, so I used one of the sheep to put lots of hoof prints throughout the field. "24 hours later that acrylic paste was dry. Next up, everything was given a coat of XF1 black. This is actually black here, it's just that I had my colour temperature set wrong on my camera. Then I blocked in the basic colours, so the road was given a coat of XF52 flat earth, The field was given a coat of a black-brown colour, and the wall was given a coat of a light grey colour. Then the individual stones on the wall were picked out. Whenever I start doing this, I always think I'll just pick out a few to highlight them, but the more you do, the more you realise that you really need to do all of them. And I'm using Vallejo model colours here, sort of browns, yellows, olive colours, greys, getting a bit of mix into the wall. At this stage it will often look quite gaudy and not particularly pleasing to the eye, but this will tone down later. In fact, if you make the colour changes too subtle now, they'll completely disappear later. In a similar way, the stones on the road were picked out. Then it was time to use some of the Diorama products that I bought a long time ago and never really seemed to use. First up being this clump foliage. Several different types of static grass. What's important here is the lengths rather than the colour. This very old bag of dried moss also came in handy. When I first bought this, I bought 2 bags of it because I thought I'd use it really quickly, and of course, well, I didn't. And some of this very long sort of thread-like material for grass. I used slightly watered down PVA to attach the grass. No static grass applicator this time, purely making the clumps in my hand and just sticking them to the glue. This particular part of the diorama is sort of an overgrown edge of a field, so the rougher looking the better. I kept the grass a little bit lighter at the sides of the road, as of course that area would see traffic, occasionally putting some of the clump foliage in there to represent moss. The sheep's field presented me with a small problem because of course even 1mm high static grass would be 35mm high in real life, and sheep have a habit of really keeping that grass down, almost to it's like a putting green kind of level. So what I did instead was apply the PVA glue and then use some of this scenic turf. This is a blend of 2 colours, a light brown colour and a green colour. I distributed that all over the glue. And tapped off the excess. Next up I took some of that moss that I had earlier and used it against a wall here to represent ferns. I put some of these elsewhere as well, but mainly I concentrated them on this wall down here. Why ferns in this field? It's one of the few things that livestock like sheep won't eat. Ferns contain a thiamine inhibitor, which is ultimately toxic to said livestock. After looking at way too many sheep reference photos, I airbrushed the sheep with a variety of base colours ranging from almost pure white through sort of tan and brown to black. Then I picked out the details, giving them either pink or black ears and noses. Different colour faces. And legs to match their faces. These of course are far too clean and in many cases far too white at the moment, but they will get muddied up shortly. In the meantime, I had airbrushed the grass black along with the rest of the base, and then put a mixture of NATO green and dark yellow onto the grass, but it didn't quite give the vibrant appearance that I wanted. It was a bit too dull, it looked a bit sort of dusty. So I took out my good old paintbrush, some bright Vallejo greens, and picked out individual strands and clumps of grass to try and bring some variety there to the scene. The ferns were also painted at this stage. Next up, the wall was given a good old dry brush, initially with a light grey colour, but also with a slightly faint green colour to simulate sort of moss and build up and so on over the years. The hinges on the gate were painted brown and then given some rust effects. And I thought, to add to the story, make it a bit clearer sort of what happened here, how these sheep got onto the road, I just painted this sign saying please keep the gate closed, and that will go on the floor broken to add a bit of narrative. A few leaves were glued into place at the base of the wall. I didn't put too many of these down because it's supposed to be a summer scene, but even then there'll always be some trapped in some areas. Finally, on the foliage front, I had these flowers from Model Scene. They're laser cut. You pull the stems off this sheet, cut the flower heads off this sheet. I always try to twist them around a bit to make them a little bit less two-dimensional. And in this case I glued them to the base before painting. For the muddy section of the field, I use these two acrylic pastes from Vallejo. This is Russian mud and black mud. They're very similar to the AK acrylic paste that I normally use. I started with a lighter colour, which is the Russian mud. This is thinned quite heavily actually with water. Once that was applied over most of the surface, I added sparing amounts of the black mud in the darker areas, the recessed areas. Everything is still wet at this stage, so it blends in quite well. And again, this black mud is heavily thinned with water. I started using Artejoal sepia oil paint, thinned with odourless thinner, as a pin wash just to highlight the details on the stone wall. And it does a good job of that. But very quickly I decided to go over the entire wall with the wash to really bring out all of the details but also to try to unify that wall which wasn't quite looking right at the time. With the oil pin wash in hand, I decided to dirty up the sheep. This sepia oil paint looks quite dark here, but as I blend it slowly up the sheep, we end up with darker areas at the bottom and lighter, fainter areas at the top, which I think makes logical sense. Certainly if we compare this sheep that has received the pin wash to one that hasn't, you can see the difference. It just brings out that detail and makes it look like it's been living in that environment. I then took some of the leftover Russian mud and black mud, very heavily thinned with water, and applied it to the hooves and the legs of the sheep, again to make them blend in with that terrain. There was one last sheep related item I had to do, and I made these from blue tack. Maybe not the most common material for modelling, but I didn't want to mix up some epoxy resin just for this. These are probably slightly too big and probably not numerous enough either, but anyway. In terms of the terrain, my final addition was some dry brushing of the XF52 flat earth. I'm not sure really how effective this was. You do have to be careful not to dislodge any of the previously added materials like the stones. In terms of the figure, I haven't shown a lot of how I painted it, because I'm not really happy with the result, to be honest. But I took some of this Vallejo English uniform. I had primed the figure and then given it a shot of black from below, and then I applied the very heavily thinned paint as a glaze over the top of that. This is very similar to the technique I used in my recent omnibus diorama. The uniform itself was okay, I wasn't too displeased with it, but I really struggled again with the face and with the other details, particularly the legs. I'm not really sure why I struggled so much, to be honest. I feel like I did a better job on the medical figures I did recently than on this. So I definitely need to be reading more of that World War II camouflage uniforms book, which I reviewed recently. Anyway, once the figure was painted, I gave her a matte varnish from VMS. Then it was simply time to add everything to the base, and my model was complete. And there we go guys, that was my build of the small English countryside diorama to go with my Tilly. I really enjoyed building this. You know, sometimes you're in a mood to build a kit, sometimes you're in the mood to paint it, sometimes you just want to create something from scratch. I didn't want to make a huge diorama, just a small snippet of everyday life. I really enjoy the creativity and the freedom that you have when you make something like this. Of course you can use reference photos, but ultimately there's a lot of leeway there. I'm really happy with the final result. I'm glad that I'm finally getting to use some of those diorama materials that I bought ages ago too. And building a bit of greenery and scenery has really sort of inspired me to have a go at one of the other two ideas that I've got on my list. One is to go with my Tamiya dinosaurs and build a sort of prehistoric scene to go with them. And another is to take these master box figures, which I've actually built and painted, and I did that a long time ago, and give them a small jungle scene. I'm not quite sure which I'll go for yet. If you've got any strong thoughts on that, or indeed on this diorama, then please do feel free to leave them in the comments below. I haven't forgotten the recent poll that I put up, where you voted for this mobile repair wagon from Miniart to be the next thing I build. I'd like to give an extra shout out to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members for the ongoing support they provide to the channel. And of course thanks to everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and until next time, have fun modelling.